Perfect timing, I'm ready. Oh, hi. Well, it's not perfect timing because you missed my announcement, which I'm going to keep brief because I started the recording. We're finishing Lunar Park tonight, which is exciting. Next week, I will be here, but we won't be reading. We're going to be taking a break. We're going to be goofing off. Maybe I'll play a game. I don't know. We'll do something. And I'm going to announce what the next book is at that time. And then the week after, we're going to start that book. So there's your recap. Catch up to speed. You love goofs? Yeah, we'll see about that. Nobody can handle mine. Please vote now on your phones as to whether I should accept or ignore Slick Yeats' Steam request. And we're going to begin chapter 28, Friday, November 7th, Saturday, November 8th. Chapter 28, Los Angeles. Oh my gosh, I'm dry as a bone today. A security guard at the gate checked my name before I drove up the winding road that led to a house the size of a hotel and made entirely from glass at the top of Bel Air. After a valet took my rental car, I stepped into a party where an old girlfriend who was wearing fake eyelashes and had married a billionaire called out, "Hey, gorgeous," when I entered the room, and we talked about old times and movie people and what she was doing with her life. I rock was all I could ascertain, and since guests seemed to be avoiding me because of my battered face, I just moved on until I was standing in a library filled with leather-bound scripts and golden retriever puppies were stumbling around everywhere, and I found an issue of next week's National Enquirer in a bathroom. And there was a framed poster in the eldest son's room of 2 words in huge red block lettering, "Get Ready." And there was the actress who had co-starred in the movie that Keanu Reeves and Jane made back in 1992, and we had what I felt was an appropriate, if innocuous, conversation since we had never met. "Jane left the set for a couple of days to be with you. Someone in your family had died, right?" "Yeah, my dad." And then Sarah's father, the record executive, showed up and seemed shocked to see me. I wasn't shocked by anything, since I wasn't reacting to anything. But then he asked about Sarah and listened haltingly as I told him how great she was doing. And even though the record executive kept promising me that he wanted to see his daughter, there would always be another setback to keep him away. But he added, not unhopefully, that Sarah was always free to visit. That was one sentence. Seated at the large dining table were wives from Pacific Palisades, with a few key members of the Velvet Mafia and Silver Lake hipsters, and couples from Malibu, and a good-looking chef with his own reality show. Conversations began as the food was served. The second Blue House in Tellerud, the new production company, the frequent trips to the plastic surgeon, the tantrum so violent the police were called, all the exertion that led to nowhere. I listened to it all, or imagined I did. There were too many words I didn't understand the meaning of anymore. Happy, cake, jingle, preen, and I was so over this world that it made no impact on me. The number of explosions per scene, the movie that took place in a submarine, the script that lacked a sympathy portal, the S&M dalliance with an underaged hooker, fucking the prom queen recovering from implant surgery, the screaming rockets, the washboard abs, the sex on the air mattress, the Vicodin binge. And then the conversation took a more sober route when talk of a certain movie came up. If it didn't gross over $1 billion, the certain movie would lose money for the 3 studios financing it. After that, the pointlessness of everyone's enterprise hung placidly over the dinner. And soon, you were noticing that the facial surgery had rendered so many of the women and men at the party expressionless, and an actress kept wiping her mouth with a napkin to stem the drooling after too much fat had been injected into her lips. A giant cactus stood blocking a downstairs hallway with the words, "Believe the Skeptics," scrawled in black across its green skin, and as storytelling resumed, I wondered how you could ever get past the cactus. But then I realized I was concentrating on that only because I wondered who was going to listen to my story. Who was going to believe in the monsters I had encountered and the things I had seen? Who was going to buy the pitch I was making in order to save myself? After the initial sight reading indicated, no, confirmed, that the house was infested, I had been driven back to the Four Seasons, where I wired a transfer into Miller's account. I was told the process would take 2 days to complete, and I did not want to know the specifics of how they planned on cleansing the house. Obviously, I told myself, there was something they knew how to do. They were professionals. They had proved this to me during the ISR, and I would stay out of their way for those 2 days by traveling to L.A. under the auspices of the Harrison Ford meeting, where I would retrieve my father's ashes from the Bank of America on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks. Carrying out this plan was my only focus. I was not going to be waylaid by anything. And so, by 2 o'clock on that Thursday afternoon, I had already booked a flight, and after meeting with Marta at the hotel to explain that the house on Elsinore Lane was being fumigated, and she would be staying with the children at the Four Seasons until I returned on Sunday, I was driving to the Midland Airport. While steering the Range Rover down the empty interstate, I called ICM and asked them to set up the meeting with Ford's people for the following day, since I was flying in that night and was leaving Sunday morning. Everything went so efficiently that it was almost as if I'd willed it. There was no traffic. I was whisked through airport security. The plane left on schedule. It was a smooth flight, and we landed before the estimated arrival time at Long Beach, since so much of LAX was under reconstruction. When I spoke to Jane while driving down the 405 toward Sunset, she was glad, which I interpreted as relieved, that I was doing this for myself. I had opted out on the Chateau Marmont, since it was a haunt from the drug days, and stayed at the Bel Air Hotel instead. It was close to the dinner party that the producer of the Harrison Ford project had invited me to when he heard I was coming to town, and also my mother's house in the valley. It wasn't until I was ensconced in my suite at the Bel Air, sorting through a stack of Harrison Ford DVDs the producer had messengered over, along with directions on how to get to his house, that I realized there was one thing I had left undone: saying goodbye to Robbie. On Friday afternoon, the Harrison Ford meeting occurred without Harrison Ford. The project that Ford and the producer and the two studio executives were interested in me for concerned a father, a tough rancher, and a son, a lonely drug addict, overcoming the obstacles of loving each other in a small town in northeastern Nevada. I sold them whatever I could muster up, which was absolutely nothing since I had no interest in the project. I was told to think about it and promised numbly that I would. And then voices asked about Jane and the kids and the new book and what happened to my face. I fell. And since I was somewhere else during the entire meeting, it seemed over in a matter of minutes. Later that afternoon, I drove to the Bank of America on Ventura Boulevard to retrieve my father's ashes. I did not leave the bank with them. I had dinner with my mother and two sisters and their various husbands and boyfriends on Saturday night in the house on Valley Vista in Sherman Oaks. An exact, if much smaller, replica of the house on Elsinore Lane, with an identical layout. My mother and sisters understood, once the press reported I was the father of Jane Dennis's son, that only when I had acquainted myself with Robbie to the point at which he felt comfortable enough would my family meet their grandson and nephew. This was the understanding that Jane and I, and our therapist, had reached, everyone except for Robbie, who knew nothing about this arrangement and had never, to my knowledge, inquired about aunts or a grandmother. The saddest moment of the night came when I realized, once they asked, that I carried no photographs of my son. There were questions about Jane, about life back east in the suburbs, about the damage to my face. I fell. My sisters marveled at how much I'd begun resembling our father as I moved toward middle age. I just nodded and asked my sisters about their recent triumphs and dramas. One was an assistant to Diane Keaton, the other was just out of rehab. I helped my mother's boyfriend, a man from Argentina whom she'd been living with for the past 15 years, grill salmon. Dinner was calm, but afterward, out by the pool, while smoking cigarettes with my sisters, a tense debate ensued about what to do with Dad's ashes. I didn't say anything about what I'd found in the safe deposit box earlier that afternoon, and then morphed into various old issues. The girl he was living with at the time of his death had a boyfriend. Had I even known about this? I couldn't remember. Of course I couldn't remember, my sisters argued, since I'd run away and refused to deal with anything. And then, in rapid succession, the invalid will, the lack of an autopsy, the conspiracy theories, the paranoia. I escaped this by heading upstairs to retrieve something from my old bedroom. This was another reason that I was in L.A. Plus, the backyard was haunting me. The pool, the chase lounges, the deck, they were all identical to the backyard on Elsinore Lane. As I stood up to leave, my sisters commented on how guarded I seemed. I told them I was just tired. I didn't want to keep our father alive, which is what we did whenever we had these inevitable conversations. I didn't tell them anything about what had been happening to me during the last week. There wasn't enough time. Inside the house, I stopped at the top of the stairs and gazed down into the living room. My reaction was dulled. Not only was my bedroom just as I'd left it as a teenager, but it was also Robbie's room as well. I'd stayed here often when I visited LA, after I made the move to Camden and then to New York, and over the years, part of this large space overlooking the San Fernando Valley had slowly transformed itself into an office where I stored old manuscripts and files on shelves built into a walk-in closet. This was where I was heading. I immediately started rummaging carelessly through stacks of papers, drafts of novels, magazine essays, children's books, until the floor became littered with them. And then I finally located what I was looking for: the original manuscript copy of American Psycho, which had been typed out on an electric Olivetti, 4 drafts in all, which continued to fill me with disbelief. I sat on the futon beneath the framed Elvis Costello poster that still hung on the wall and began flipping through its pages. Without even knowing what I was looking for, I felt a vague desire to touch the book and rid myself of something that Donald Kimball had said. There was a piece of information that had never fit into the pattern revealing itself to us. I wanted to make sure that it did not exist, but as I kept turning pages, I began knowing what it was. It made itself apparent the moment I hit page 207 in the original manuscript. On page 207 was the drawing of a face. I had drawn a face into the thin sheet of typing paper, leaving enough space between the chapter breaks to fit it in. And beneath the face I drew the words, scrawled in red pen, "I'm back." The image of the words scrawled in blood was used later on, but I'd cut the scene that preceded this warning. The chapter had been omitted, and I'd also removed the crude drawing of the face from any subsequent manuscripts. Something became confirmed. This was a copy of the manuscript I had shown to no one. This was the copy that had been rewritten before I handed the book to my agent. This was the copy that no editor or publisher had ever seen. This was the one chapter I had cut from the very first draft and that no one but me had ever read. It included the details of the murder of a woman called Amelia Light. I flashed on the cell phone call I received on November 5th. "What did you do to her?" I'd checked that dirty little book you wrote again. The fictional details, the missing arms and head, the ropes, the blowtorch, were identical to the details of the murder in the Orsic Motel, in a place called Stoneboat, according to what Donald Kimball had imparted. As I kept turning the pages, I realized even before I arrived at the next chapter that it would be titled Paul Owen. The murder that followed Amelia Light's would be Paul Owen's. Donald Kimball was wrong. Someone was tracking the book, and a man named Paul Owen in Clear Lake would be the next victim. I reached for a phone to call Donald Kimball, but something stopped me. I reminded myself again, this time with more force, that no one except me had ever seen this copy of the manuscript. This led to, what was I going to say to Kimball? What was there to say? That I was going insane? That my book was now reality? I had no reaction, emotional, physical, to any of this, because I was now at a point at which I accepted everything that presented itself to me. I had constructed a life, and this is what it now offered me in return. I pushed the original manuscript away from myself. I stood up. I was moving toward a wall of bookshelves. I was flashing on something else now. I pulled a copy of the vintage edition of American Psycho from a shelf. I flipped through it until, on page 266, I found a chapter called Detective. I sat back on the bed and began to read. May slides into June, which slides into July, which creeps toward August. Because of the heat, I've had intense dreams the last 4 nights about vivisection, and I'm doing nothing now, vegetating in my office with a sickening headache and a Walkman with a soothing Kenny G CD playing in it. But the bright mid-morning sunlight floods the room, piercing my skull, causing my hangover to throb, and because of this, there's no workout this morning. Listening to the music, I notice the second light on my phone blinking on and off, which means that Jean is buzzing me. I sigh and carefully remove the Walkman. "What is it?" I ask in monotone. Patrick?" she begins. "Yes, Jean?" I ask condescendingly, spacing the 2 words out. "Patrick, Mr. Donald Kimball is here to see you," she says nervously. "Who?" I snap, distracted. She emits a small sigh of worry, then, as if asking, lowers her voice. "Detective Donald Kimball?" Yes, the room turned sharply at that moment, and yes, my idea about the world changed when I saw the name Donald Kimball printed in a book. I forced myself not to be surprised, because it was the only narrative saving itself. I did not bother rereading the rest of the scene. I simply placed the book back on its shelf. I had to think about this. First thought. How did the person who said he was Donald Kimball ever see this original unread manuscript with the details of Amelia Light's murder in it? A murder that was identical to the one that occurred on November 3rd in the Orsic Motel. Second thought, someone was impersonating a fictional character named Donald Kimball. He'd been in my house. He'd been in my office. I suddenly realized, hopefully, that everything he had ever told me was a lie. I suddenly hoped there had been no murders. I hoped that the book I'd written about my father was not responsible for the deaths Donald Kimball had relayed to me. Will I find out later that this Donald Kimball's private number was in fact Amelia Light's cell phone number? Yes, I will. But then I thought, if Donald Kimball was responsible for the murders in Midland County, then who was Clayton? As I thought about this, I glimpsed something by my shoe. There was a drawing from a children's book I'd made when I was a boy. One of a number of pages had scattered to the floor as I rifled through my closet. These pages were from an illustrated book I'd written when I was 7. The book had a title. The title was The Toy Brett. I slowly reached down to pick up the title page, but stopped when I saw the tip of a black triangle. I pulled the other pages away until the entire sheet was revealed, and I was confronted with the wrecked stare of the Turby. As I moved the pages around, I saw the Turby replicated 100 times throughout a book I had written 30 years ago. The Turby emerging from a coffin, the Turby taking a bath, the Turby nibbling the white petal of a flower, the Turby drinking a glass of milk, the Turby attacking a dog, the Turby entering the dog and making it fly. It was at this moment in L.A. on that Saturday night in November, when I saw the children's book about the Turby and knew that a person named Donald Kimball did not exist, that I made a decision. If I had created Patrick Bateman, I would now write a story in which he was uncreated and his world was erased. I would write a story in which he was killed. I left the house on Valley Vista. Driving back to Bel Air, I began formulating a story. I began making notes. I needed to write the story hurriedly. It would be short, and Patrick Bateman would be killed. The point of the story, Patrick Bateman was now dead. I would never find explanations. That's because explanations are boring, the writer whispered as I drove through a canyon. Everything would remain disguised and remote. I would struggle to piece things together, and the writer would ultimately deride me for attempting this task. There were too many questions. This would always happen. The further you go, the more there are. And every answer is a threat, a new abyss that only sleep can close. No one would ever say, I will show you what happened, and I will make everything perfect by taking you to the vacant places where you won't need to think of this anymore. Back at the hotel in Bel Air, I slipped Dead Heat on a merry-go-round into the DVD player, simply because it was the first credit on Harrison Ford's resume, and I wanted background noise. It would wash out the distracting silence. I sat down at the desk and opened my laptop and began writing as the movie played. Formlessness quickly led to shape. Patrick Bateman stands on a burning pier. I sat motionless during the half hour it took to write the story. The story was static and artificial and precise. It wasn't a dream, which is what a novel should be. But that was not the purpose of this story. The purpose of the story was to let myself be carried into the past, advancing backwards and rearranging something. The story was a denial. Soon Patrick Bateman's voice was resonating faintly, whispering and scattered, until he flickered away and was void. But he was curious, and he lusted, the writer argued. Was it his fault that he'd abandoned his soul? Even as he is consumed by flames, he says, I am everywhere. At the exact moment I was completing that last sentence, voices from the TV forced me to acknowledge them. I turned in my chair to face the screen, because coming from the TV, 33 minutes into the movie, were the words, paging Mr. Ellis, paging Mr. Ellis, paging Mr. Ellis. An impossibly young Harrison Ford in a bellboy's outfit wanders through the bar of a hotel. He's looking for a guest. He has a message. James Coburn is sitting at a table in the bar, checking out waitresses when he glances over and says, Boy? Harrison Ford walks over to James Coburn's table. Bob Ellis, James Coburn asks. Robert Ellis, room 72? I spun around to the computer and clicked save. No, sir, Harrison Ford replies. Charles Ellis, room 607. Are you sure? Coburn asks. Yes, sir. Oh. And then Harrison Ford wanders deeper into the bar, calling out, Paging Mr. Ellis, Mr. Ellis, paging Mr. Ellis, Mr. Ellis, until his voice disappears from the soundtrack. When I looked at the clock above the TV, it was 2:40 a.m. End of chapter 28. That's fun. Some things I want to talk about before we move on. First of all, that was exciting. That was the culmination of everything. That was the scene I found out about that made me want to read this book, the death of Patrick Bateman. That's the movie Dead Heat? Yeah, he said that. First of all, for the most perceptive of you... Oh, no, I was making sure it was your... Yeah. Gotcha. For the most perceptive of you, which I know one of you is that perceptive, the I'm back face is actually referenced in the novel American Psycho, but the face is not depicted. He references drawing something. Patrick Bateman references drawing something in blood, and underneath it the words "I'm back," but he doesn't say what he drew. And he says something like, "It looked like this," and then the page is blank. It's one of my favorite scenes in the book. I like the denial, of it, where he says, "I drew this," and then there's nothing there. I love it. It's very sort of creepy. So that was cool. Obviously, the other things the most perceptive among you might have noticed, it was like from the beginning probably that Donald Kimball was the name of the detective in American Psycho. I mean, I don't know how big nerds y'all are, but like when I first read this book, it was obvious to me from the first interaction. And the fact that he didn't question it made me think it was some kind of artistic choice. Like the fact that the diner he goes to with the paranormal investigator is named Dorcia. Like I figured it was one of those artistic choices where he was like changing the name. But apparently Brett didn't notice. And I did. So what does that say about you, Brett? Let me think if there was anything else I wanted to say about it. Oh, I like the brief but very punchy description of Patrick Bateman's death. The line, "Even as he is consumed by flames, he says, 'I am everywhere,' is fun. I'm a fan of that. Yeah, good chapter. I'm going to run to the restroom real quick, and then we will start chapter 29 of, I want to say 32? Of 31, actually, and chapter 30 is just one page, so we basically have 2 chapters left, but the last one is quite long. Okay, I'll be right back. All right, folks, let's hit it. Let's not waste any time. This feeling of being the one who has a piece of evidence like the scene with the picture denial didn't need to be brought back up. It's like when the cops withhold the method of murder or something. Does that make sense? His own guard against someone saying he killed people, holding it that long. I kind of see what you're saying. Like the author for real, yeah, not the character Bret Easton Ellis. Oh God. Okay. All right, we still got a lot to go. I'm gonna hit it. Chapter 29, The Attack. Oh fuck! Hold on, my fucking chair's stuck. I hate my gay ass chair. Fuck. It's the mat. It's not the chair. But it's easy to blame the chair. They can't defend themselves. Chapter 29, The Attack. Sunday, November 9th. Robert Miller had begun the cleaning on Thursday, November 6th, starting with the exterminator he always used in such cases, tenting the house at 6 o'clock that evening. On the following night of November 7th, Miller's team set up their equipment in 307 Elsinore Lane and left, returning on Saturday night, exactly 24 hours later, and once it was understood that the space had been cleaned, removed their equipment from the house. This was all relayed to me by Robert Miller in a phone call after my plane landed at the Midland Airport at 2:15 on Sunday afternoon, as I was driving the Range Rover back into town. Miller felt confident that the house was safe. He mentioned specific changes that had occurred after his team returned on Saturday. He also assured me that I would be pleased with these transformations. The damage that had occurred during the ISR was not corrected, the door that flew from its hinges, the hole punctured in the wall, but he insisted I would be gratified by the physical differences in the rest of the house. After this conversation, my need to see the house was overpowering. Instead of heading to the Four Seasons, I drove to 307 Elsinore Lane. The first thing I noticed, and I grasped at this as I pulled up to the house, was that the lily-white paint had returned, replacing the pink stucco that had infected its exterior. I remember parking the Range Rover in the driveway and walking toward the house in awe, my hand clutching the keys, and the sheer relief washing through me caused my body to feel different. The regret that had been defining me lifted off, and I became someone else. I walked to the side of the house, now the same blank white that had been there in July, and I touched the wall and felt nothing except a sense of peace that, for once, I hadn't imposed upon myself. It was genuine. Inside the house, I felt no fear. There was no trepidation anymore. I could sense the change. Something had been freed. There was a new scent, a lack of pressure, a difference that was tangible, but still able to somehow announce itself forcefully. Sorry, that was intangible, but still able to somehow announce itself forcefully. I was surprised when Victor came loping out of the kitchen to greet me in the foyer. Did they just leave the dog? No longer in the basement kennel at the hotel, he was wagging his tail and seemed genuinely excited by my presence. There was none of the usual glowering reluctance emanating from him whenever I entered his line of vision. But I couldn't concentrate on the dog for long, since the living room had changed miraculously. The green shag had returned to a flat beige sheet, and the curtains from 1976 that were hanging from a window only days ago had disappeared, and the furniture was arranged as it had been when I moved in. I closed my eyes and thought, thank you. There was a furniture... Oh my God. I can't be coming apart this early. There was a future, though not in this particular home. I was already planning on moving elsewhere. And I could think about the future, because after becoming so used to things not working out, I now, for one moment, believed things could change. And the transformation of the house validated this. Victor's licking of my hand caused me to reach for the cell phone in my pocket. I dialed Marta. The following exchange was pieced together following a conversation I had with Marta Kaufman on Tuesday, November 18th. Marta? Hey, what's up? She said. Are you back? Yeah, I'm actually here at the house. I drove in from the airport to check it out. I paused as I moved into the kitchen. Well, everything's been pretty good. What's Victor doing here? I thought I told you not to... Oh, yeah, Marta said. We just brought him back this morning. Why'd you bring him back? He was freaking out in the kennels, and the hotel told me we had to get him out of there. Since you told me the house would be finished by Sunday, we dropped him off a couple hours ago. Is he okay? Yeah, he's okay. At this point, I'd moved out of the kitchen and into the foyer. I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and then, with no hesitation, I started climbing them. Well, he was completely unhinged over here, Marta said. The cages were small, and he just wasn't happy, and of course Robbie and Sarah started getting upset. But once we dropped him off at the house, he seemed fine. He totally relaxed, and How are the kids? I asked, cutting her off, realizing how unimportant Victor seemed to me. Well, Sarah's right here with me. What about Robbie? Marta Kaufman later testified that I asked this with an unnatural urgency. Robbie went to the mall with some friends to see a movie. Who came back to the house when you dropped Victor off? I do not recall asking this, but according to Marta Kaufman's deposition on November 18th, I had. We all did. Marta paused. Robbie needed to pick up some stuff. I do remember, however, that at this point I was heading toward Robbie's door. Pick up some stuff for what? I asked. He said he was going to spend the night at a friend's. What friend? Ashton, I think. She paused. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he said Ashton. Before walking into the room, I murmured something that neither I nor Marta Kaufman could recall on November 18th, but was, according to the writer, why would Robbie have to pick up stuff if Ashton lives next door? Brad, it's no big deal. It was just some clothes. He was in his room for 10 minutes. Nadine Allen's picking them up from the mall. He should be back at their place by 4. Can you give me a cell phone number? Marta sighed, which pissed me off. I recall that flicker of rage, and gave it to me. I'm coming right back to the hotel, I said. I'll see you guys in about 20 minutes. Do you want to talk to Sarah? After hanging up on Marta, I dialed Robbie's number. I waited by his door. There was no answer. But I wasn't worried, and I didn't leave a message. Why would I? He was at the Fortinbras Mall with friends, and they were watching a movie, and he had diligently turned off the phone once it began, a scenario impossibly distant from what actually happened that day. And then I would see him back at the hotel, and even though we were not checking out of the Four Seasons and returning to the house, that was never going to be an option. Robbie could still spend the night at the Allens, even though at that moment I had a shivery premonition about this being a school night. And Jane would come back on Wednesday, and our lives would move on as they were supposed to ever since I had accepted Jane's offer and moved to Midland County in July. I thought expectantly about the upcoming holidays, even while I stared at the gnawed, cracked door in front of me. I don't remember actually opening the door to Robbie's room, but for some reason I do remember the first thing that came to my mind when I walked in. It was something Robbie had told me when he was pointing out things in the night sky at that picnic in Horatio Park over the summer. The stars you see in the night sky actually do not exist. The room was still in the same state it was left in on Wednesday when we fled the house. An unmade bed, the dead computer, an open closet. I moved slowly to the window and looked out onto Elsinore Lane. Another quiet Sunday, and everything felt okay with the world. Is that a sentence you ever thought you would actually write? I stood in the room for a long time, taking inventory. What I had not done, I had not turned around. I had walked straight into the room. I'd stood there. I'd contemplated my son and his motives. I did not see what was behind me. At first I didn't understand. It took a moment to grasp. When I turned around, I saw, scrawled across the giant photo mural of the deserted skate park in massive red lettering, "Disappear here." I breathed in, but did not start panicking immediately. I wasn't panicking because something on the floor caught my eye and momentarily replaced the panic with curiosity. It was sitting next to the open door off to the side. As I neared it, I thought I was looking at a large bowl made from chewed-up newspaper scraps. It was, that someone had placed 2 black rocks in. I assumed it was an art project of some kind. But the black stones were wet. They were glistening. And as I stood above the bowl, looking down into it, I realized what it actually was. It was a nest. And in the nest, the black oval objects were not stones. I knew immediately what they were. They were eggs. There was another nest next to the closet door, and another one I found later in the guest room. I flashed on something Miller had warned me about. Miller had said that fumigation was necessary so that nothing living would be left in the house once the cleansing began. That was why the house had to be fumigated. The spirits, the demons, would try to find anything living to enter so they could, quote, continue their existence. A question. What if a doll had hidden itself and waited? What if the Turby had hidden itself in the house? What if it had survived the exterminators? What if something else had entered it? The connection between the doll and the nests was sane and immediate. I remember rushing out of the room and tumbling down the staircase, gripping the railing so I wouldn't fall. When I hit the foyer, I started dialing Robbie's number. Again, I don't remember this exactly, but as I waited to leave a message, I think that was when I noticed Victor. Because of Victor, again, I didn't leave a message for Robbie, but if I had called a third time, as any number of people did later, I would have been told that the cell phone had been deactivated. Victor was lying in a fetal position, shivering on the marble floor of the foyer. The grinning dog that had excitedly eloped toward me minutes ago did not exist. He was whimpering. When he heard me approach, he looked up with sad, glassy eyes and continued to shake. "Victor?" I whispered. The dog licked my hand as I crouched down to soothe him. The sound of his tongue lapping the dry skin of my hand was suddenly overtaken by wet noises coming from behind the dog. Victor vomited without lifting his head. I slowly stood upright and walked around to his backside where the wet noises were coming from. When I lifted the dog's tail, I tried leaping out of my own mind. The dog's anus was stretched into a diameter that was perhaps 10 inches across. The bottom half of the turbie was hanging out of the dog and slowly disappearing into the cavity, undulating itself so that it could slide in with more ease. I was frozen. I remember instinctively reaching forward as the talons of the doll disappeared, causing the dog's body to bulge and then settle. Victor quietly vomited again. Everything stayed still for one brief moment. And then the dog began convulsing. I was already slowly backing away from the dog, but as I did this, Victor, or something else, noticed. His head suddenly jerked up. Since the dog was blocking the front door, and I didn't want to step over it, I had started moving back up the staircase. I was moving deliberately. I was pretending to be invisible. Victor's whimpering had suddenly morphed into snarling. I stopped moving, hoping this might calm Victor down. I was taking deep breaths. The dog, still curled on the marble floor of the foyer, began foaming at the mouth. Foam, in fact, was simply pouring out of his mouth in a continuous stream. It was yellow at first, the color of bile, and then the foam darkened into red, and there were feathers in it as the foam continued pouring out, and then the foam became black. At that point, I remember running up the stairs. And in what seemed like an instant, something, it was Victor's jaw, had clamped itself around my upper thighs. I was midway up the curving staircase. There was an immediate pressure, a searing pain, and then wetness. I fell into the stairs, face first, shouting out. I turned over on my side to kick the dog away, but he'd already backed off. The dog was standing, hunched, 3 steps below where I was writhing. Then the dog started expanding. The dog began mutating into something else. His bones were growing, and then breaking out of his skin. The noises Victor was making were shrill and high-pitched. The dog looked surprised as his back suddenly bent up, and his body stretched another foot on its own accord. The dog made another pain sound and then started gasping for breath. For one moment, everything was still. And as I wept, I reached over, mindlessly, foolishly, to comfort the dog, to let him know I was his friend and that he didn't need to attack since I wasn't a threat. But then the dog's lips peeled back, and he started shrieking. His eyes began rolling in their sockets involuntarily until only the whites were visible. I started screaming for help. At the moment I began screaming, the dog lurched forward, slamming itself against the wall as it kept enlarging. I tried to stand up, but my right leg was so damaged that I collapsed back onto the staircase, the steps slippery from all the blood pouring from the wound in my thigh. The dog stopped moving again and started shuddering as its face elongated and became lupine. Its front paws were manically scratching at one of the steps with such force that they were shredding the smooth, varnished wood. I kept trying to push myself up the stairs. The dog lowered its head, and when he slowly looked back up, approaching me, he was grinning. I kicked at it with both feet, panting, backing myself up the staircase. The dog continued its approach. The dog cocked its head, and then it started shrieking again. Its eyeballs bulged until they were pushed out of their sockets and hanging down his muzzle on their stalks. Blood began pouring from the empty holes, drenching the dog's face, staining its bared teeth red. It had what looked like wings now. They had sprouted out of both sides of the dog's chest. They'd snapped through the ribcage and were flapping themselves free of the blood and viscera that were keeping them weighed down. It crept up toward me. I kept kicking at it, and effortlessly, a mouthful of teeth sank into my right thigh again and bit down. I reared up, screaming, and blood sprayed in an arc across the wall as the thing let go of my thigh. It was suddenly freezing in the house, but sweat was pouring down my face. I began crawling up the stairs on my stomach when it bit me again, right below the place it had just ripped open. I tried to shake the thing off. I began sliding back down toward the dog because the stairs were so wet with blood. It lashed out again. The teeth were now the fangs of the turbie, and they sank into my calf. I realized with an awful finality that it wanted to keep me still. It didn't want me to go anywhere. It didn't want me to rush to the Fortinbras Mall. It didn't want me to find Robbie. I became furious, and I smashed my hand into the dog's face as it kept blindly snapping at me. Fresh blood burst from its snout. I smashed my hand again into its face. The face kept spouting blood, and the dog continued shrieking. I started screaming back at the dog. I was sliding in place as I looked up to see how far I had to go before reaching the landing. It was about 8 steps. I started pulling myself upward, dragging my mangled leg behind me. And again I felt the thing leap on my back when it realized where I was going. I whirled over, knocking the thing off me. I thrashed around in all the blood, trying to kick it away. I vomited helplessly onto my chest and then whispered, "I hear you, I hear you, I hear you." But this promise didn't work any longer. The dog gathered strength and reared up like a horse on its hind legs, looming over me, its wings obscenely outstretched, flapping them, spraying us with more blood. At that moment, I lifted my left leg up and, without thinking, kicked it hard in the chest. It toppled back, trying to beat its wings to keep in place, but they were still too heavy with blood and flesh, and it fell backwards, sliding to the bottom of the staircase and landing on the floor, shrieking while trying to scramble upright with insectile urgency. On the landing, I began crawling madly toward Robbie's room at the top of the stairs. Below me, the thing had righted itself and started scrambling up the staircase after me, snapping the horribly uneven rows of fangs that now made up its mouth as it neared. I lunged forward and slid into Robbie's room, slamming the door shut and locking it with a hand soaked in blood. The thing threw itself against the door. It had moved up the staircase that quickly. I lifted myself up and clumsily hopped on one foot toward the window. I collapsed in front of it and fumbled with the latch. I looked behind me because it was suddenly so quiet. Beyond my trail of blood, the door was bulging forward. And then the thing started shrieking again. I opened the window, balancing on my left leg, and crawled onto the ledge, blood spattering everywhere. I remember not caring as I let myself fall. It wouldn't be a long drop. It would be escape. It would be peace. I landed on the lawn. I didn't feel anything. All the pain was concentrated in my right leg. I lifted myself up, and I began limping toward the Range Rover. I slid into the driver's seat, and I started the ignition. When asked, I answered that I did not know, nor can I supply a reason now, why I hadn't gone to a neighbor after the attack. Moaning to myself, I put the car in reverse and pressed on the accelerator with my left foot. Once I'd backed out of the driveway and was stationary in the middle of Elsinore Lane, I saw the cream-colored 450 SL. It had turned the corner of Bedford and was now a block away. Watching it glide closer, I saw someone in the driver's seat, grim-faced, determined, recognizable. As if he'd been sequenced into my dreams, it was Clayton who was driving the car. When I saw Clayton's face, I let go of the steering wheel and the Range Rover, still in reverse. I let go of the steering wheel, and the Range Rover, still in reverse, spun backward, and then halfway around so that it was blocking Elsinore. I tried to regain control of the car as the 450 SL kept moving forward. It was speeding up. I braced myself as it slammed into the passenger side of the Range Rover. The collision pushed the SUV over a curb and into the oak tree that stood in the middle of the Bishop's front yard with such force that the windshield exploded. Everything started falling away from me. The 450 SL extracted itself from the wreckage and backed away into the middle of Elsinore Lane. The Mercedes was not damaged. It was daylight, I noticed, as I began losing consciousness. Clayton stepped out of the car and started walking toward me. His face was a red and indistinct moon. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn when I saw him that Halloween day in my office at the college, including the sweater with the eagle on it, the sweater I had once owned when I was his age. Steam was curling from the Range Rover's crumpled hood. I couldn't move. My entire body was throbbing with pain. My leg was soaked with blood. It kept gushing through the bite marks in my jeans. "What do you want?" I started to scream. The Range Rover kept shuddering because my foot was locked against the accelerator. The boy was floating closer, moving steadily toward me, relaxed. Through my tears, I began to make out his features more clearly. "Who are you?" I was screaming as I sobbed. "What do you want?" Behind him, I could see the house melting away. He was now standing by my window. He was staring at me so starkly it was as if he were sightless. I tried positioning myself so I could open the door, but I was trapped. "Who are you?" I kept screaming. I stopped asking that question as his hands reached out to me. That was when I realized there was someone else who was more important. "Robbie," I started moaning. "Robbie." Because Clayton was, and always had been, someone I had known. He was somebody who had always known me. He was somebody who had always known us, because Clayton and I were always the same person. The writer whispered, "Go to sleep." Clayton and the writer whispered, "Disappear here." End of chapter 29. How exciting. We actually, for a brief moment there, just for a very short time, we actually approached the level of intensity and disturbing content that the most tame scenes in American Psycho had. All right, let's do chapter 30 because it's short. Chapter 30, The Awakening. I regained consciousness in a hospital room at Midland Memorial the day after the first surgery to save my leg was completed. The operation lasted 5 hours. I'd been sleeping for more than 24 hours. When I woke up, Jane was standing over me. Her face was swollen. My first thought, I'm alive. The relief was short-lived when I saw the 2 police officers in the room. My second thought, Robbie. I realized that they'd been waiting for me to wake up. I was asked, "Brett, do you know where Robbie is?" The room was cold and empty, and I felt something humming beneath the fake calm. There was a horrible insistence to the question that was barely restrained. I whispered something that caused the disturbance. What I whispered was not what they were hoping for. Jane's exhausted face died. I became blinded by it. When we were told that Robbie Dennis was now officially missing, I could not describe the sounds Jane began making, and neither could the writer. End of chapter 30. All right, boys and girls, let's do this. Just as this book began with a freaking juggernaut of a lengthy-ass chapter, so too shall it end with one. But I am no mere mortal. And we're going to knock it out right now. Thank you to everyone who has been with me on this ride, who's read Lunar Park with me. I present to you Chapter 31, The Endings. Questions the writer asked me. How long do you hold on to a child? You have to decide if the world is worth returning to, and in the end, what are your options? I know where Robbie went, but do you? For the first few days after Robbie's disappearance, I was still recuperating and underwent 4 more operations. So substantial was the damage to my right leg, and during this time I was lost in the mercy flow of the morphine drip. Ultimately, the leg would be saved, and doctors told me I should be grateful, but the only thing I could think about was Robbie. There was nothing else to take the place of that. We were conscious of only that one thing. We could only wait, and then, as time passed, we began waiting without hope. But Jane kept coming out of the cave she would hide herself in and emerge newly determined, even after admitting it was all useless. Why? Because I'd offer her something to grasp onto with the deposition I gave when I told the Midland authorities I believed our son was a runaway and that he had not been abducted. When asked why I believed this theory, I realized very quickly that there was nothing to sell them. I had not seen the emails to, or from, the other missing boys on the afternoon of November 5th, because the computer had died, and when the police searched the house after the attack, the computer was no longer in Robbie's room, even though I told them I was positive I'd seen it. And the evidence of a conspiracy, a drunken Nadine Allen, the playful whispers of boys in the courtyard of a mall, the 2 Salvation Army boxes I'd glimpsed in Robbie's room, no one could ascertain if any clothing was missing or not, and the 12 trips we eventually estimated he made to mailboxes, etc., in October alone, the point of which we still could not decipher, was too thin to hang anything on. But, again, what did it matter if they ran away or if they'd been kidnapped? The boys were gone. All that anyone knew was that Robbie and Ashton had been dropped off at the Fortinbras Mall by Nadine Allen on the morning of November 9th. According to Nadine, Robbie was wearing a backpack and had bought tickets for a movie that began at noon. Robbie, according to an oddly calm and eerily serene Ashton, had whispered that he needed to use the restroom and left the theater. He never returned. No one saw him wandering the mall. No one saw him anywhere else in Midland County. Only the writer saw him disappearing into his new world. Jane could not fathom my lack of fear or anger. She called my despair rehearsed. Her resentment toward my acceptance caused us almost immediately to separate from each other. Our only consolation, nothing worse can come to us. I didn't want explanations, because in those, my failure would take shape. Your love was a mask, the scale of your lies, the irresponsible adult at loose, all the things you hid, the mindless pull of sex, the father who never paid attention. The case received at first substantial media coverage, but because Jane refused to participate in the parade of grief that was demanded of her, the press lost interest. From there were so many fresh horrors. The dirty bomb in Florida, the hijackers who killed the air marshals, the disappearance of a movie star's son took a back seat to what was becoming this country's future. Jane hired a private investigator to stay on the case. But what case? Boys leave. He was gone. He'd orchestrated this absence himself, as had all the others. Jane went into seclusion, while Sarah just kept asking, "When is Robbie coming back?" until the question conspired against her, and additional meds were prescribed so that Sarah became as catatonic as her mother. And even though I knew Robbie was never coming back, and that Robbie had left us, and that he had wanted to leave, I still asked why. The writer whispered answers to me that I half heard before the ambient took effect. Because his spirit had been broken. Because you never existed for him. Because in the end, Brett, you were the ghost. Regarding the details of the attack, I didn't tell anyone about them. How could I? Even though I remembered enough of what happened that I relive it daily. People seemed satisfied that the dog had attacked me, and there was too much evidence. My mauled leg, the blood on the staircase leading to Robbie's room, the manager of the kennel at the Four Seasons verifying that Victor had been unstable and uncomfortable and behaving strangely, that the dog had to be removed, for my story not to make sense. And it made sense because I never mentioned what the Turby did. However, when I described what happened on the street concerning the accident with the Range Rover and the 450 SL, I was greeted with skepticism. At that point, my recollection was deemed unreliable by everyone, and I was supposed to be comforted by the idea that I had lost too much blood to remember anything clearly. When Anne and Earl Bishop called 911 and ran out to the car smashed against their oak tree, they did not recall seeing another vehicle. The scenario that had seemed most viable was that I had swerved out of the driveway, losing consciousness, and careened into the oak in the Bishop's yard. There was minimal evidence, very faint traces of cream-colored paint, that another car might have been involved. But since no cream-colored 450 SL was registered in this or any bordering state, my account of the accident was written off. It was considered a memory lapse due to blood loss. In other words, I had hallucinated the car and the boy walking toward me. All the writer would say, "That boy was you." Also, Victor was not found. Something that the authorities first thought was perhaps a skinned deer was located that Sunday afternoon in the woods behind the house. But there was no blood trail leading from the house to the woods where it died, which meant that whatever had attacked me had not dragged itself all the way from the second floor of the house and across the meadow to the bank of trees. The writer mentioned that something had crawled up the chimney. The writer mentioned that something had flown across that field. The veterinarian who examined the carcass determined it was most likely a coyote that somehow had been turned inside out. I never discovered exactly what it actually was, but according to the veterinarian, it was not Victor. The police who surveyed the scene at the house had confirmed the existence of the nests, but in the end, these were attributed to something your son had made, though Robbie took no classes at Buckley in which any remotely similar project had ever been assigned. But did it really matter? What part did the nests play in the unfortunate incident with our dog? When I asked about the objects in the nest, I was told that they were cracked open and empty. They were just the remnants of shells. Why did you want to know this, Mr. Ellis? I was asked with a grave concern bordering on hostility. The writer whispered so no one could hear him. Tell them they hatched. Added note. When I was found in the Range Rover, my hair had turned completely white. I was allowed to resign from the college. When I cleaned out the office a week after my release from the hospital, I finally looked at the manuscript that Clayton had left on November 4th, entitled Minus Numbers. It seemed almost to the word the rough draft of the novel I had written my freshman term at Camden, the novel that became Less Than Zero. Only one copy existed before I rewrote it, and, like the others, it was on a shelf in a closet in the bedroom in Sherman Oaks. But by then I had stopped wondering how Clayton had gotten a hold of this. When I went back to L.A., I compared the manuscript to mine, and it was a total duplicate. It was an exact replica. Even the misspellings and typos had been transcribed. The reason I let go of this was that there was no information suggesting that Clayton had ever existed. This is the easiest route to take, the writer assured me. But Amy Light had existed, and the body that was discovered in the Orsic Motel was, in fact, hers. The man responsible for her murder, Bernard Erlinger, had presented himself to me as Donald Kimball, a man who believed he was, in fact, Patrick Bateman, a man who had become so obsessed with a book and its main character that he fell over the edge. Bernard Erlinger, who had run an unsuccessful detective agency in Pierce that never had any affiliation with the Midland County Sheriff's Department, confessed to the killings that Donald Kimball had told me about in my home on November 1st. These admissions were made after Bernard Erlinger was arrested outside a residence in Clear Lake, wearing an Armani linen suit, a cotton shirt and a silk tie, leather wingtips from Cole Haan, and a raincoat. He was also carrying an axe. The residence belonged to Paul Owen, 65, a widower who ran an independent bookstore in Stoneboat. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on the Sunday morning of November 9th, Paul Owen had heard someone breaking into his home. He dialed 911. He locked himself in his bedroom. He waited. Someone tried to open the door. There was a pause before Bernard Erlinger began swinging the axe at the door repeatedly until a patrol car arrived. He was arrested and, without any questioning, simply admitted to the killings of Robert Rabin, Sandy Wu, Victoria Bell, and Amy Light, as well as the attack on Albert Lawrence, the transient he had blinded the previous December. I did not want to know anything more about Bernard Erlinger. I did not want to believe that Bernard Erlinger had anything to do with the murders in Midland County, because I wanted to believe the killer never existed. I never disputed the crimes. They actually happened, and people had died brutally. But I still wanted to believe that the killer was fictional, that his name was Patrick Bateman, not Bernard Erlinger or even Donald Kimball. And for a brief time over the course of a year, he had become real, as so many fictional characters ultimately are for their creators, and for their readers as well. The reasons I wanted to believe this, and a part of me still does, not only lie in the Amelia Light murder and that unread draft of American Psycho, but also because of the exact moment I finished the story at the Bel Air Hotel, in which Patrick Bateman dies burning at a pier. The Clear Lake Patrol arrived at Paul Owen's residence. 4 weeks after Robbie was officially declared missing, Ashton Allen disappeared. Jane left Midland County and moved to Manhattan, as did I. She wanted a divorce, and there was nothing to negotiate, but I learned a few things. I hadn't known there was a house in Ammanganset that Jane had recently purchased for the family, or that she'd already planned an elaborate Christmas trip to London that was going to be a surprise, and now, of course, was cancelled. When I'd arrived in Midland County that summer, I did not pay attention to the fact that Jane wanted to build a long future with her husband. She really had wanted things to work out between us. But she should have known that she could look right through me. She should have known that the reason I was there had nothing to do with her, but that I was just trying to locate some place where I might find the will to live again. The process of the divorce struck me as fairly meaningless, since we hardly seemed married in the first place. But her lawyer insisted. Jane wanted a complete break, and she didn't want anything connecting us ever again. I would give her that. No contact whatsoever with her or Sarah. I was distressed, but explained to my lawyer that our strategy was one of acceptance. So I met with our respective lawyers, men we were paying $600 an hour to help terminate everything, on a warm, rainy day the following April, in an office of the Empire State Building. I apologized for being late. My reason? I'd never been to the Empire State Building before. An important pause seemed to fill the room after I admitted this. Hands were extended, smiles were forced. It was hard for me to stay awake because of the heroin I was now taking daily. As if in an echo chamber, I heard someone mention that since there'd been no prenuptials, would this cause a difficulty with the proceedings? No. Our son was lost, so the word custody never came up. Jane waived alimony. My lawyer tiredly went through the rest of the motions. Jane was thinner and didn't say anything to me, which made me flash back to a time when we were so close that we could finish each other's sentences. I wanted to tell her that I still loved her, but that was not what she wanted to hear. She kept tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I'd never seen her make before, but which she constantly repeated during the 45 minutes in her lawyer's office. We were so high above the city that I had to focus very hard on the wide oak desk in front of us in order to not drop free-falling into vertigo. What was framed within the window was an aerial photograph. I was considering Europe when I asked myself, why are Jane and I taking the easy way out? But then it was over. The papers had been signed. I was the first to leave the office. As I pushed the button for the elevator, I had to clench my jaw tightly so I wouldn't start crying. For reassurance, I reached in my raincoat and touched the gun lodged in there that I now carried with me everywhere. On Fifth Avenue, I could barely raise my arm to hail the cab that would take me back to the condo on 13th Street, the space I had first moved to in the spring of 1987 when I was a young and famous novelist and didn't know anything except that luck kept sighing over me. A place where it seemed as if I had all kinds of time, a place where fame seemed to be a good idea, and the flash from a light meter had been my only source of guidance. By now, I was living with a young sculptor named Mike Graves, who was about 12 years younger than me, and sometimes he was in the condo on 13th Street, and sometimes he was in his studio in Williamsburg. I fell into the relationship not knowing what I was doing or whom I needed, and I assumed he felt the same, or at least I hoped he did. He had a grimness, a resolve that I mildly responded to, and I liked the way he folded himself against me, and how he would trace his fingers over the scars on my leg, and I needed him on the mornings when summer lightning would awaken me from nightmares, and twisting in bed, I would grasp his hand and moan my son's name. Sorry, 1 second. I actually had the cab drop me off on 3rd Avenue, half a block from the condo, and I floated into Kiehl's to buy Mike a particular type of shampoo I remembered he kept in my apartment. Over the store speakers, Elton John was singing Someone Save My Life Tonight, and the song followed me back out onto 3rd Avenue. It had been a song my father had liked, and one night while we were driving through the Westwood during the summer of 1976, when I was 12, he had even asked me who sang it, and when I told him, he turned the volume up, and the fact that he liked the song made me grateful. Outside Kiehl's, I ran into a college classmate who had moved into Manhattan the same year I had, and had just gone through his second divorce. The wife had left him for someone on the Mets, and I vaguely remembered reading about it. He was tan and had gray in his hair, which I immediately noticed, and I was suddenly ashamed of the coloring I had done to mine the day before in the Avon Center at the Trump Tower. He had read about the disappearance of my son, actually taking hold of my hand as he told me how deeply sorry he was, a man I barely knew, and commented wryly about my breakup with Jane. Marriage is about love and divorce is about money. And when I answered certain questions, he observed that I was speaking too slowly. I made vain gestures with my hands, trying to explain things. He'd been through rehab recently, and as we compared notes, I could tell, as he hurriedly walked away, that he knew I was high. His last words were, "Well, maybe next time?" I walked across the street to a deli on the corner, where I bought a Post since I was now reading my and Robbie's horoscope daily. Follow the tea leaves, avoid tragedy, ignore pentagrams, guess the hint, reconcile the future, the possible blazing, sleeper awake. And as I shuffled slowly back to the condo, I stopped in the middle of the block and turned around. Someone had been singing softly behind me, but no one was there. The song was so familiar that I shuddered. It wasn't until I lay down in my empty space that I realized it was the sunny side of the street. And then I floated into a very soft place, surrounded by all the framed photos of Robbie I'd clipped from newspapers and magazines concerning his disappearance. This grim shrine to his biography sat in an orderly row on a shelf above my bed. Your dark throne, Mike called the sloping shelf, shivering. The heroin flowing through me, I thought about the last time I saw my father alive. He was drunk and overweight in a restaurant in Beverly Hills, and curling into myself on the bed, I thought, what if I'd done something that day? I had just sat passively in the booth at Maple Drive as the midday light filled the half-empty dining room, pondering a decision. The decision was, should you disarm him? That was the word I remember, disarm. Should you tell him something that might not be the truth but would get the desired reaction? And what was I going to convince him of, even though it was a lie? Did it matter? Whatever it was, it would constitute a new beginning. The immediate line, "You're my father and I love you." I remember staring at the white tablecloth as I contemplated saying this. Could I actually do it? I didn't believe it, and it wasn't true, but I wanted it to be. For one moment, as my father ordered another vodka, it was 2 p.m, this was his 4th, and started ranting about my mother and the slump in California real estate and how your sisters never called him, I realized it could actually happen, and that by saying this I would save him. I suddenly saw a future with my father, but the check came along with the drink, and I was knocked out of my reverie by an argument he wanted to start, and I simply stood up and walked away from the booth without looking back at him or saying goodbye, and then I was standing in the sunlight, loosening my tie as a parking valet pulled up to the curb in the cream-colored 450 SL. I half smiled at the memory, for thinking that I could just let go of the damage that a father can do to a son. I never spoke to him again. That was in March of 1992, and he died the following August at the house in Newport Beach. Lying in bed on 13th Street, I realized the one thing I was learning from my father now, how lonely people make a life. But I also realized what I hadn't learned from him, that a family, if you allow it, gives you joy, which in turn gives you hope. What we both failed to understand was that we shared the same heart. There was one last story to write. I went back to Los Angeles in August, and on the afternoon of the anniversary of my father's death, I waited in the parking lot of the McDonald's on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks. It was 2:30. After composing myself sufficiently, I left the car and limped into the restaurant. I was still using a cane. I ordered a hamburger, a small bag of fries, a child's Coke. I wasn't hungry, and I took my tray and sat at a table by the window. The 450 SL pulled into the parking lot at exactly 2:40. A boy, 17, maybe 18, who looked strikingly like Clayton, stepped out of the car. He was taller now, I noticed, and his hair was short, and even though he had sunglasses on, I recognized him immediately. I was holding my breath. I watched as he walked hesitantly toward the entrance. He had a shadow. This was evidence. Once inside, he spotted me and moved with confidence toward the table I was trembling at. The world became hushed. I pretended to be absorbed in the task of opening the paper the hamburger came wrapped up in, and then I lifted it to my mouth and took a small bite. Robbie was sitting across from me, but I couldn't look at him or say anything. He was silent as well. When I looked up, he'd taken off the sunglasses and was staring at me sadly. I started crying while chewing on the hamburger and wiped my face while trying to swallow. All I could say before turning away was, "I'm sorry." "It's okay," he said softly. "I understand." His voice had deepened. He was older now, and he was no longer the shy boy I knew in those months on Elsinore Lane. And there was something in him that suggested forgiveness. His secret life made him seem less brooding, less sullen. Something had been solved for him. The actor was gone. I had to keep turning away from him because I was breaking down. "Why did you leave?" I managed to ask in a hoarse voice. "Why did you leave us?" "Dad," he sighed. The words sounded different from how he'd said it in the past. He placed his hand on mine. It was real. I could feel it. "It's okay." I reached over and touched his face with the palm of my other hand, and then his shyness returned and he looked down. "Don't worry," the boy said. "I'm not lost." He said it again. "I'm not lost anymore." I wanted another chance, but I was too ashamed to hear his answer. I asked anyway. "Robbie," I choked, my face wet. "Please come back." But all he eventually saw was the flowering smile of acceptance. He was standing outside now, staring through the window at me for one last time. He was looking at this story with affection. I noticed my son had left a drawing behind, a landscape of the moon. It was so detailed that I had to linger over it, wondering about the patience required of my son to draw this particular moonscape. Where did this burning, ceaseless intention come from? I also saw that one word was written on it, and I touched the word with a finger. I didn't know what brought him here. I didn't know what called him away. He was returning to the land where every boy forced into bravery and quickness retreats. A new life. Wherever he was going, he was not afraid. The cream-colored 450 SL pulled out of the lot and turned right onto Ventura Boulevard, merging with the traffic until it was lost from sight, and then the story ended. The meeting lasted only minutes, but when I limped back to my car, it was twilight. Across the street from the McDonald's was the Bank of America where my father's ashes were stored. What I hadn't told anyone was what happened on the 8th of November when I had gone to retrieve the ashes. When I opened the safe deposit box that day, the interior was grayed with ash. The box containing what remained of my father had burst apart, and the ashes now lined the sides of the oblong safe. And in the ash, someone had written, perhaps with a finger, the same word my son had written on the moonscape he had left for me. In a fishing boat that took us out beyond the wave line of the Pacific, we finally put my father to rest. As the ashes rose up into the salted air, they opened themselves to the wind and began moving backwards, falling into the past and coating the faces that lingered there, dusting everything. And then the ashes ignited into a prism and began forming patterns and started reflecting the men and women who had created him and me and Robbie. They drifted over a mother's smile and shaded a sister's outstretched hand and shifted past all the things you wanted to share with everyone. "I want to show you something," the ashes whispered. You watched as the ashes kept rising and danced across a multitude of images from the past, dipping down and then flying back into the air. And the ashes rose over a young couple looking upward, and then the woman was staring at the man, and he was holding out a flower, and their hearts were pounding as they slowly opened, and the ashes fell across their first kiss, and then over a young couple pushing a baby in a stroller at the farmer's market, and finally the ashes wheeled across a yard and swept themselves toward the pink stucco of the first and only house they bought as a family on a street called Valley Vista. And then the ashes swirled down a hallway, and behind the doors were children, and the ashes flew across the balloons and gently extinguished the candles burning delicately on the store-bought cake on the kitchen table on your birthday. And they twirled around a Christmas tree that stood in the center of the living room and dimmed the colored lights stringing the tree. And the ashes flowed with the racing bike you pedaled along a sidewalk when you were 5, and then drifted onto the wet yellow slip-inside you and your sisters played on, and they floated into the air and landed in the palm fronds surrounding the house and a glass of milk you held as a child, and your mother in a robe watching you swim in a clear lit pool, and a film of ash sprawled itself over the surface of the water, and your father was pitching you into the pool, and you landed joyfully with a splash, and there was a song playing as a family drove out to the desert. "Someone saved my life tonight," the writer says. And the ashes dotted the Polaroids of your mother and your father as young parents, and all the places we went as a family, and the lit pool kept steaming behind them with the scent of gardenia flowers rising up into the night air, wavering in the heat, and there was a small golden retriever, a puppy, bounding around the sides of the pool, ecstatic, chasing his frisbee, and the ashes dusted the Legos that were spilled in front of you. And in the morning there was your mother waving goodbye and calling softly, and the ashes kept spinning into space with children running after them, and they dusted the keys of the piano you played and the backgammon board your father and you battled over, and they landed on the shore in Hawaii in a photograph of mountains partially blocked by lens flare, and darkened an orange sunset above the rippling dunes of Monterey, and rained over the pink tents of a circus and a Ferris wheel in Topanga Canyon, and blackened a white cross that stood on the hillside in Cabo San Lucas, and they hid themselves within the rooms of the house on Valley Vista, and the row of family portraits, drifting all over the promises canceled, and the connections missed, the desires left unfulfilled, and the disappointments met, and the fears confirmed, and every slammed door, and reconciliation never made. And soon they were covering all the mirrors in every room we lived in, hiding our imperfections from ourselves, even as the ashes flew through our blood, and they followed the brooding boy who ran away, the son who discovered what you are, and everyone was too young to grasp that our life was folding in on itself. It was so foolish and touching to think at one point that somehow we would all be spared. But the ashes pushed forward and covered an entire city with a departing cloud that was driven by the wind and kept ascending, and the images began getting smaller, and I could see the town where he was born as the ashes flew over the Nevada mountains, mingling with the snow that fell there, and crossed a river. And then I saw my father walking toward me. He was a child again and smiling, and he was offering me an orange, held out with both hands, as my grandfather's hunting dogs were chasing the ashes across the train tracks, dousing their coats, and the ashes began bleeding into the images and drifted over his mother as she slept and dusted the face of my son, who was dreaming about the moon, and in his dream they darkened its surface, and as they flew across it, but once they passed by the moon was brighter than it had ever been, and the ashes rained down earthward and swirling, glittering now, were soon overtaken by a vision of light in which the images began to crumble. The ashes were collapsing into everything and following echoes. They sifted over the graves of his parents and finally entered the cold, lit world of the dead, where they wept across the children standing in the cemetery, and then somewhere out at the end of the Pacific, after they rustled across the pages of this book, scattering themselves over words and creating new ones, they began exiting the text, losing themselves somewhere beyond my reach, and then vanished, and the sun shifted its position, and the world swayed, and then moved on, and though it was all over, something new was conceived. The sea reached to the land's edge, where a family, in silhouette, stood watching us until the fog concealed them. From those of us who are left behind, you will be remembered. You were the one I needed. I loved you in my dreams. So, if you should see my son, tell him I say hello, be good, that I am thinking of him, and that I know he's watching over me somewhere, and not to worry, that he can always find me here, whenever he wants, right here, my arms held out and waiting, in the pages, behind the covers, at the end of Lunar Park. The end. So how's everybody doing? It's a fun last chapter. It's probably my favorite chapter in the book. Really brings things to a close. Before we close out, though, I would like to say this book was written in loving memory of Michael Wade Kaplan, 1974 to 2004, who was Brett's boyfriend. The character that Mike Graves is based on, who tragically passed away around the time of the completion of this book. So just wanted to give him a recognition. Imagine writing this entire book to reach out to your estranged son instead of being a good father. Were you not here when we talked about this? The book is not real. He doesn't have a son. Happy Pride Month. Yeah, Happy Pride Month. It's true. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that. I enjoyed it. We've gone pretty long today, so I'm not going to drag it out with a bunch of stuff I have to say. Really, I think we did a good job with this book talking about the stuff I wanted to talk about as we went, so it doesn't really warrant a big, long discussion at the end. But if you guys have anything you want to add, definitely we can talk about that. In the meantime, as a reminder, next week, we will be taking a quote-unquote week off. We will still be here, but we will not be reading anything. We will be goofing off. I think probably, I know this is not popular, but I will probably be breaking out a couple of the U quizzes, because it's pretty funny to me, the U quizzes. I really like this book, especially that last chapter. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, I really liked the last chapter too. It's easily my favorite chapter. And yeah, next week we'll be announcing what the next book is. And I would announce it tonight, but I'm kind of torn between 2 books, and I'm gonna sort of make that really torn between 3 books, and I have a week to figure out which one it's gonna be. So that's why you're gonna get that announcement next week. It's not just to force you to come watch me take U quizzes just to get that info. I mean, I'll tell you on Discord. Like, it's okay. It's not clickbait, or whatever you want to call that. I'm glad you liked it. I really liked it. When I first sought out this book, when I first made the decision to read this book, I had read American Psycho, and I had heard, I think probably from like Googling different things and reading the context behind American Psycho, that he wrote another book that was considered sort of a sequel to American Psycho, you know, that was, and I read the quick description and saw that it was like sort of metatextual and was ostensibly about Patrick Bateman, you know, coming out of the book, and I thought that, like, haunting him, and I thought that was a super cool premise. And I read it, and I was like, that's not what it's about. It's not about that at all. It's actually just about Bret Easton Ellis basically reconciling with, like, basically creating a big fake story that allowed him to work through the intense emotional trauma that writing and publishing American Psycho put him through, which, you know, I think is pretty valid, right? Like, he dredged up a lot of his own personal issues to fuel that book, and then he sort of had them paraded around by the media storm that it caused, and there was a lot of really legitimate and founded fears that it was inspiring real life murderers, and yeah, just really the whole experience. I think the point of Lunar Park is not necessarily his daddy issues. The point of Lunar Park is that writing and publishing American Psycho put him through hell. And the daddy issues are, you know, were a part of writing and publishing American Psycho. It was kind of about, you know, it was partially about his father, which from what I gather, that a lot of that stuff is the accurate part. From what I've read, his father, Robert Ellis, was real, and from what I can tell, was pretty much existed as described in this book. But the other characters were not real. Yeah, that was, we talked about that a little bit. I think, Craig, you missed that. Because I was like mad when I started reading about it, and I was like, what the heck? Like, what do you mean it follows the adventures of a fictional character named Bret Easton Ellis? I'll take that hell, I need money. Well, yeah, you say that, but then you have to actually do it. Like, you could take that hell right now if you wanted. You would just have to write a book that was as painful and horrifying for you as American Psycho. And you can start that anytime you want, right? We could all start that anytime we wanted. I could do that tomorrow, but there's a reason we don't. Yeah, it's a good time, though. It definitely is not what I expected when I picked it up, but I enjoyed it anyway. Let me think if there was anything, like any references that we didn't get to go over, because we covered Donald Kimball and the Dorsey Cafe and the Mike Graves thing. Is there any other references I wanted to mention? I'm flipping through a little bit to see. Oh, now would be a good time to. I think now would be a good time to reference the 3 literature quotes that this book starts with on its like pre first page. I can't remember if I read them out initially, but these are the 3 quotes that Bret chose to put on the blank beginning page of the book. The first one is Thomas McGain, Panama. The occupational hazard of making a spectacle of yourself over the long haul is that at some point you buy a ticket too. From John O'Hara, we have people who have made up their minds about a man do not like to have their opinions changed, to reverse their judgments on account of some new evidence or new arguments. And the man who tries to compel them to change their minds is at least wasting his time, and he may be asking for trouble. I understand that one. I understand exactly what he means by putting that one in here. That one's for you, reader who knows who you are. And then the last one is from Hamlet, and it says, "From the table of my memory, I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, all saws of books, all forms, all pressures past, that youth and observation copied there." Wow, I don't know what that means, LOL. I do. I think maybe you gotta live as one to get it. Well, thank you so much to everybody who read Lunar Park with me. It was a really good time. I'm glad I got to share it with you. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I'm happy that you guys seem to have. And I think we could all use a break next week. So if you want, you can show up here. We'll be goofing off. You can feel free to drop requests if there's, if you have an idea for something, there's a game you want me to play or something. Like I don't really have a plan. It's not going to be like a birthday stream thing where I've concocted an evil scheme. It's just going to be low key. It probably won't go for super long. I'm just taking a week off and decided that goofing off would be better than not streaming at all, basically. So hope to see you there. Even if I don't see you there, I will be obviously publishing to Discord the announcement for our next book. You want to play some games? You have some ideas? My inbox is open. You can get with me on that. So thank you so much, everybody, and I think that's good night.